And earlier this year, I was contacted by Mr. Chad Lewis, our presenter this evening, about some programs that he does. And one of them was Paranormal Wisconsin. And so, of course, I thought that would be a great program for us to offer in October, our month of Halloween and spooky things. So he is here this evening. He is a researcher, author, and lecturer on topics of the strange and unusual, with a background in psychology. And he did some work in the field, but for the past 20 years, he's been traveling around the world looking for unique and bizarre stories and history. And he has been to places such as Costa Rica, Guatemala, West Virginia, here in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, Iowa, looking for Bigfoot, and even looking at the Beast of Bray Road in Elkhorn. So I am eager to find out what he's going to talk to us about this evening. A couple of, or one other thing, if you have questions as we go along, there should be a little chat feature down at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type in your question and we will do our best to answer them. We will probably do the questions at the end of the program so that Chad can tell us what he has to say. So without further ado, Chad.
Well, hello and welcome. Thank you. As I get my screen here to share with you, give me 1 second here. While I'm getting this together, I'd like to thank the library for having me here this evening. But just as important, all of you who were brave enough to show up to talk about Paranormal Wisconsin from the safety of wherever you're watching this program. As you heard, my name's Chad Lewis. I'll be your presenter this evening. And although my background is in the field of psychology, for the last 25 years, I've traveled the globe in search of the strange and unusual. Everything from hunting for vampires in Transylvania, looking for the Loch Ness Monster, crop circles, UFOs, alien abductions, really, really weird people, odd places, you name it. If it's just strange and a little offbeat, I've traveled the world in search of these oddities. But what I discovered on my travels is that sometimes the weirdest things happen right in your own backyard. So that's what we're going to explore tonight. Some of Wisconsin's scariest and most bizarre paranormal stories. For the next 45 minutes or so, we'll take a tour across the entire state. I'm going to give you the background, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts. I'll talk a bit about some of our research at these places. There we go. Heck, I'll even provide you with the directions to these places. But I'm going to leave it up to each and every one of you to travel to these places on your own and determine for yourself whether or not you believe the stories are real. But I should warn you, it's a lot different watching these places on television than it is visiting them. Because when you're out in the middle of nowhere and you see that shadowy creature lurking from tree to tree, you simply can't turn to another channel and forget all about it. So with that in mind, let's explore Paranormal Wisconsin. First stop, UFOs. Now it should come as no surprise that we have reports of UFOs here in our state, because not only does Wisconsin have the UFO capital of the world, we have 3 of them. All the towns of Elmwood, Belleville, and Dundee all claim to be the UFO capital of the world. All 3 of them have UFO Day festivals where you can go and participate and learn the history of all the UFO sightings. In fact, one of the weirdest stories you'll ever hear about UFOs happened in Eagle River, Wisconsin in 1961. Small little tourist town, and it happened to this gentleman, Joe Simonton. Simonton was a plumber and part-time farmer. Well, one day while having a late breakfast, early brunch, Simonton looks out his window and sees what appears to be some sort of craft descending into his yard. Simonton claimed that this craft was about 30 feet wide, 12 feet high, and had all these little muffler type things around it. I have to give Simonton credit. He had never given much thought to UFOs, so he wasn't spooked by it. He actually went out to investigate it. And when he did, an opening appeared on the craft. He said it was hovering a little bit off the ground, and an opening like the trunk of your car flipped open. There he could see one of the things inside, the inhabitant, the alien, the human, the pilot, whatever it was. He could see a couple others on board. They were all identical looking. He said they were all very small, short, with dark hair, dark skin, and dark eyes. He said they reminded him of very small Italian men. Simonton couldn't even make eye contact with the leader because it was so piercing to look at him. The leader comes up to the front and he's holding a jug and he motions for water. So Simonton, realizing they need water without any verbal communication, goes to fill his jug up in his house. When he comes back, he hands it to the man or the thing. And he looks over and one of these things seems to be cooking something over a flameless type grill or apparatus. The leader recognizes Simonton's interest, and Simonton motions with his hand like eating. He's trying to get a conversation going. The leader walks over and trades Simonton and gives him a couple of what the media were calling these UFO pancakes as a trade for the water. I told you this was going to be a weird case. Simonton ate one of the pancakes, said it was the worst tasting pancake he'd ever had. He said, no wonder these things are so small. If this is what they're eating, that's terrible. Then the hatch closed up and the thing rocketed off out of sight. Simonton had no idea at the time, but other people were reporting UFOs flying in the area of Simonton's farm. I spoke with a gentleman who was a teenager at the time. He was on his farm with his mom and some friends hanging out when they saw a ship hover over their farm and move off into the distance right where Simonton lived. Simonton, as you can imagine, reported it the way he saw it. But you can't imagine how many people contacted him after his sighting went public. In fact, in the first week after he reported it, over 1,000 people came to his farm looking for those UFO pancakes. Simonton wrote what he remembered of the story, and he put it out in a little pamphlet. Soon, Dr. J. Allen Hynek of Project Blue Book and 2 graduate students from Illinois came up and interviewed Simonton and checked out the farm he was living on. They all thought he was a credible witness, but they thought he had snapped and gone psychotic, living out on his own in a farm. He had gone stir crazy and had cabin fever. They thought maybe he was suffering from a waking dream, but they didn't want to embarrass him, apparently, so they didn't say any of that publicly. They just said they didn't believe the story, but they thought Simonton was credible. Simonton was upset with all the publicity he received, the negative publicity. And like a lot of people who have had an experience where it goes public, they wish they never would have said anything. In fact, legend is Simonton had more experiences. But after the one, he simply would not report them. He did have the pancakes analyzed. Some say they came back as nothing more than buckwheat pancakes you'd make in your kitchen. Others say they came back with things not of this world. But I'll leave it up to you to determine whether Simonton was trading pancakes for water with some extraterrestrial beings. And it's one thing to trade water with these creatures. It's another when they seemingly take you against your will. That's exactly what happened to a family in Bloomer, Wisconsin. For decades, they had had weird experiences that they chalked up to hallucinations or bad dreams or nightmares. That is until one night when the mother was sleeping in her bed. This is not her. She was sleeping in her bedroom. This is her bedroom. When she awoke in the middle of the night with the urge to go to the restroom. Nothing out of the ordinary there. So she walks back to the back of the house. The restroom, the bathroom, is right at the bottom of your screen, right off of the picture. But as you can see in the back, she has some pane glass windows overlooking her backyard. It's the middle of the night. She has to go to the bathroom and she's walking back. She peeks out the back window and sees what appears to be a bunch of lights over the woods. When she stops to look, she realizes that one, they're not just lights. They seem to be attached to some sort of craft. Based on the size, she thought maybe it was the distance, thought it was maybe the size of a house. The second thing she noticed was that the lights were moving toward her house. They were not stationary. But here's the odd thing. As she's standing in the middle of the night, watching a UFO in her backyard, having to go to the bathroom, her first thought was, did I lock the front door? Kind of an odd thought to have, but you'll see why she thought it in a moment. She goes darting to the front door. Out the window, she told me she could see mysterious balls of light like these floating in the front yard. She immediately thought to herself, I'm too late. They're already here. At that moment, the door began to open on its own, and a heavy fog started to roll in. She braced herself against the door to close it, but it kept opening. She said it wasn't a pressure like someone kicking it in to break in, but just a constant, consistent pressure opening the door. The last thing she remembered about the door was seeing a hand come in from the outside to grab at her. She claimed that that hand wasn't human. She thought it looked more like some weird alien hand. Next thing she knew, she was back by the bathroom staring at the UFO. This time, it was floating away from the house, back toward where it originated from. The next morning, she awoke, this is not her, with the idea that it was nothing more than a bad dream like she had experienced so many times before. That is until she went out in the backyard to play with the kids and her husband, and they noticed this weird burn mark in the back where the UFO was hovering. A few months later, she contacted the late researcher Craig Lang and myself to investigate. By the time we got there, several months had gone by, but we brought Geiger counters, we took soil samples and grass samples, found nothing out of the ordinary. The witness also agreed to be hypnotized and go under hypnotic regression with Dr. Thomas Franklin, the department chair of psychology at UW-Stout. Together with Dr. Franklin, we went up and Dr. Franklin hypnotized her through a hypnotic regression session. And there she recalled being taken that night by three beings she described looking like this. Of course, we know these creatures as the Greys, the oval-eyed, almond-eyed, oval-headed creatures that you see all over the media. Under hypnosis, she recalled being taken that night and being put through some medical procedures. She didn't know what they were doing. But what terrified me the most was the fact that sitting in the room, listening to her recount this story, is she told that every time she's been brought on board this craft, she recognized upwards of a dozen other humans on board undergoing the same procedures. She didn't recognize them as friends or family, but knew that they were human. She also didn't know, but others had reported a similar looking creature. In fact, the late researcher Bud Hopkins was working on a case on the East Coast where that family awoke and found a burn mark in their backyard. 1,000 miles apart? Is it more than a coincidence? I'll leave it up to you. Keep in mind, we still get hundreds of reports every year from people who still can't explain what they're seeing in Wisconsin skies. But UFOs aren't the only weirdness in our state. Perhaps the most infamous creature out there, or thought to be out there, is that of the Bigfoot, known throughout the world as the Bigfoot, the Yeti, the Yowie, the Sasquatch, the abominable snowman. When most people think of these creatures, they think of the heavily forested western states. They don't often think of the Midwest. But every year I receive dozens of reports of people who have come face to face with these unknown creatures. One of my favorite stories happened in Granton, outside of Neillsville, Wisconsin. In the year 2000, this part-time farmer, James Hughes, also had a delivery route for newspapers. And when he was finishing up delivering the newspaper, he was coming home. It was just getting light out. And he was driving not too far from his house when all of a sudden he slowed down. He saw something big on the side of the road. It looked like a bear passing over. But when he got closer, he realized it wasn't a bear at all. As he came to almost a complete stop, he saw this creature scurrying over the road. It seemed to be carrying some roadkill or freshly killed prey, a goat or a deer or something in its hand. But Hughes told me that he didn't quite know because he was so terrified by what he had seen, he almost swerved off the road. He went home and told his wife. He wasn't going to report it because he knew how it sounded. But the next day he did make the report, and the officer went out with him looking for footprints or fur or droppings. Nothing was found. When I went to interview Mr. Hughes, I also brought my colleagues Kevin Nelson and Noah Voss there. We were looking through the area to see what possibly could have caused him to see a Bigfoot. I also interviewed a local gentleman raising livestock, thinking maybe if it was carrying this thing, it was one of his animals that went missing, but he was not missing any. James Hughes told me that he had other people contact him, neighbors. Once his story went public, neighbors told him they had seen a similar looking creature. Until the day he died, Mr. Hughes believed he had encountered some animal that was unknown to science as of today. But not all stories continue on forever. Right here is the small town called Steinthal on the eastern portion of the state. Today, there's not much there. It's a ghost town, abandoned. But in the 1960s and 70s, this was a hotbed of Wisconsin paranormal activity, all because of this house. It was out in the middle of the country, an old abandoned farmhouse where people would drive out because they thought it was haunted. They would see mysterious lights in the window. They would hear disembodied voices talking, but nobody was there. They would see shadowy figures, but again, the place was empty. So many people went out there that it started getting a reputation for a monster that lurked, because all around the house was swampland, marshland, as you can see in this extremely grainy newspaper photo of the time. But that's when people started seeing a large Bigfoot-looking creature with green eyes. And I say eyes as plural because witnesses thought it had 3 green eyes to it. They had no idea what to call this thing, so they called it the Thing. Many people would spot it. Many people would go to the old Steinthal Tavern, which was located right where this religious chapel is today. They would go there, and it must have been a weird place because everything I found about the Steinthal Tavern were basically advertisements of exotic dancers there every weekend. But people would go there and sit out front and wait for the monster to appear, where it usually would be spotted right by the old mill right across the street where my colleague Kevin Nelson is standing. Today, the story's been all but forgotten, But if you talk to locals, they still tell the story of the Steinthal thing, wondering where it went, if it's still lurking in the marshlands, waiting for its next victim. Here I am over in Scotland looking for the Loch Ness Monster on one of my expeditions there. I'm the one in the blue without the really cool beard. But little did I know, if I wanted to stay to see sea serpents, I should have stayed in Wisconsin. Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Wisconsin was overrun with places that believed a monster was inhabiting them. As of today, I've collected over 40 different lakes, rivers, and streams in our state where they thought the monster was residing or still resides. One of those places is in one of our most visited state parks. That is Devil's Lake State Park. It's a place of mystery and history, known for its effigy mounds, which were Native American burial grounds, often raised up in the shape of an animal that could be best viewed from the sky. There are still several effigy mounds at Devil's Park. Archaeologists believe that at one time we had 20,000 of these effigy mounds in Wisconsin, but today we have less than 4,000. They also believe that the lake was a place of mystery and it was a bad medicine. Many translations of the name refer to it as Mystery Lake, Spirit Lake, Sacred Lake, and of course, Devil's Lake. The origin of the lake tells that it was formed mainly by the sea serpents that were fighting with the giant thunderbirds of the sky. The thunderbirds would drop down big boulders on the sea serpents, who would shoot up giant spouts of water at the thunderbirds. Legend tells that the sea serpents won, and they still are in Devil's Lake, and the thunderbirds flew off to different parts, mainly to Illinois. The first native people there feared the lake. There's an old oral tale that tells of a man going down to the lake shore. When he saw it start bubbling up like it was boiling, only to see a giant tentacle come out, grab him, and pull him under to his watery grave. In fact, anyone that went missing, it was blamed on this giant monster of the lake. These stories date back many, many years. 1892, people were out on the lake when all of a sudden they saw a giant leviathan of the deep, a huge sea serpent, rise up. It was moving toward them, but it was darting back and forth as though it was looking for something or someone. That's when out of nowhere, they saw a second identical looking creature come up, and the two began fighting. They fought so hard, the waves almost capsized the boat. Then they saw the creatures descend to the bottom of the lake, and they did not see them rise up. There are many weird things at Devil's Lake outside of the sea serpents. People have found what they thought were alligators in the lake. 1901, a man was convinced he had seen an alligator in the lake. Of course, we all know alligators are not native to Wisconsin and would have a very hard time surviving our winters. So what was it? Stories go back even more of Devil's Lake being a place of weird legends. In fact, one of the legends tells that the lake is haunted as well. Many unsuspecting visitors report seeing the ghostly image of what appears to be a native man out in a canoe on the lake, vanishing right before their eyes. A legend that has sprung up more recently tells of a ghostly spirit that wanders the campground of Devil's Lake, looking for those who have the best fire. So I always encourage people, when they stay at Devil's Lake, make sure your neighbors have a little better fire than you do, so you will not be cursed by that spirit. This time of year, people often want to go to haunted places, places where they can have their own paranormal experience. One of my favorite places is in Green Lake, a place called Dartford Cemetery. Many of you are probably familiar with the name. A few years ago, we did a program on the Discovery Channel called A Haunting that featured this cemetery. For decades, people had wandered through the cemetery only to report seeing and hearing what appeared to be phantom children out in the cemetery. Wondering why they were out at such times of the night or not properly dressed for the weather, people would investigate only to have them vanish right into thin air. Others claimed that they could hear the playing and laughing and singing of children, but no children were there. I had collected so many stories of these disembodied voices that when we went there, we brought a ton of recording equipment with us, hoping to capture these voices. But while we were there, not a peep. But others told us about their story of a spirit that they see out at the cemetery, because many people report seeing what appears to be a man dressed in full native regalia. This is a rural cemetery, small, so he stands out a bit. So people watch him, only to see him vanish right over the grave of a former chief of the area. I talk about this case quite a bit. People like to go there for their own experience, including this group that sent me a photo they took that they couldn't explain while they were there. Some weird mist or fog that wasn't visible to the naked eye. But my favorite part of the story is the dare. A lot of haunted places have dares attached to them. You have to do something in order for the legend to come true. The dare at Dartford Cemetery is you have to find the haunted mausoleum. Don't worry, it's the only mausoleum there. The dare is that if you're brave enough or foolish enough to stand or sit on top of the mausoleum, you will be shoved to the ground by the angry spirits buried inside. I spoke with a high school football player. He told me he was out there with his buddies when he was sitting on top of the mausoleum. His buddies were off of it. When all of a sudden someone or something pushed him from behind so hard, he barely had time to extend his arms and break his fall. Well, the mausoleum sits about 6 feet in height. So whatever pushed him had to have a lot of strength behind it. But I know what you're thinking. This is nothing more than superstition and teenagers with their imagination. A few years ago, I spoke in Green Lake. After the program, a woman came up to me and said, "Chad, I sat out on that mausoleum last night. I wasn't pushed to the ground." In fact, she continued, "I don't even think it's haunted." Well, I was relieved because this woman was in her 70s out there looking to get shoved to the ground by the angry spirits. I'll leave it up to you to try the dare for yourself. This next case I thought I would bring up. With everything going on in society right now, in all the different movements and awakenings we're having in our society, it's only fitting that we bring up the Spring Grove Cemetery, because this cemetery is the final resting place of Belle Boyd. Belle Boyd, if you do not recall, was a Civil War spy for the Confederacy. She would come up to the north, get men drunk, flirt with them, and take the information back to the south and give it to the generals. Her gravesite is here. Now, the odd part is we're not in the South. We're in Wisconsin. Not only are we in Wisconsin, but her grave is at the most visited place in Wisconsin, Wisconsin Dells, the water park capital of the world. What happened was, after the Civil War, Belle Boyd went on a speaking tour. And after her tour in Kilbourne, which is now Wisconsin Dells, she dropped dead. All the southern groups wanted her to be buried down south, but her family said she died in Wisconsin. She should be buried here. So they came up with a compromise. They brought up a truckload of dirt from the south so she could be buried in the south while being buried in the north. Since that time, many unsuspecting people of the cemetery have reported seeing what at first glance were Civil War reenactors. But when they look closer, they look like Confederate Army ghosts, only to vanish right before her grave. Others say they see these people walking around as though they're protecting the grave. When I talked to the current cemetery caretaker, he told me the legend that a former caretaker was said to have been working, getting the cemetery in order, when he saw several of these Confederate soldiers walking right up to Belle Boyd's grave and then vanishing right before his eyes. According to legend, he walked right down to City Hall, put his keys down, and said he quit and refused to ever return. You can go out there and see the grave and make up your own mind. Although today, I don't think there'd be as many people worried about her being buried in the South. They could come and get her, and I don't think there'd be much of an argument with people in Wisconsin. If you're ever heading out past Stevens Point, I recommend you stop at Highway 66. Except the locals, they don't call it that. They call it Bloody Bride Bridge. Legend is, many years ago, while coming home on her wedding night, a young woman was killed in a car accident, and she bled to death on this very bridge. Now, many unsuspecting motorists driving over the bridge report seeing what appears to be a woman in a bloody bridal gown walking across the bridge and vanishing out of sight. One of the first witnesses was said to be a law enforcement officer who, driving at night, all of a sudden saw a woman in a bridal gown right in front of him. He slammed on his brakes, braced for impact, closed his eyes, and when he came to a screeching halt, he got out to see the damage or help the victim, except nobody was there. He scoured the area, left convinced that he had run over the vanishing woman. But the dare gets even better. And the dare tells that if you park your car on the bridge, when you stop and look into your back mirror, not only will you see the ghost of that bloody bride, but many claim that she'll actually be sitting right in your back seat. Now, luckily or unluckily for me, the dozen or so times I've waited for her, she has not appeared in my back seat, knock on wood, but maybe she will appear for you. But if you're going to do this dare, be careful. This is a very busy bridge. I would not want to have to add you to my program as another ghost haunting this bridge who lost their life out there. So do it at your own risk. This is one of the first cases I ever started investigating 25 years ago, a case I'm still working on today. Right outside of my hometown of Eau Claire is a small place called Elk Lake Dam. One night, don't worry, there's nothing to see here. Two men were sitting where the first arrow on the bottom is pointed, just watching the water go by. It's a gorgeous natural area. That's when, where the top arrow's pointing, one of the men turned around and saw what appeared to be a glowing woman in white standing behind him. So he nudged his buddy and said, "Hey, do you know there's a glowing woman behind us?" His buddy said, "Yep, but I'm too afraid to turn around and look." About a half hour went by, they scurried out of the area. One of them brought me back to the area. At the time, I was a UW Stout student studying psychology. One of the cohorts in my program was a young man named Aaron. He believed he was psychic, intuitive. He could pick up these spirits. So I brought him along on the investigation. We got there. We wanted to take a photo of where the two men would have been sitting. We were going to take a photo of one another. But as you can see, Aaron's camera did not work. It worked before and after, but it would not take a photo. My camera did snap a photo. And when we had the film developed, back when people actually used film, we noticed this weird mist or fog right where the two men saw that woman. I didn't see it with the naked eye, but only when the film was developed. So I started talking about this case quite a bit. After a program, a man came up to me and told me he lived out there in the 1970s. He recalled there was a murder out there, but that's all he remembered. Sure enough, I started digging through the newspapers and found that in 1974, a young woman was murdered out there. But not just any nameless, faceless young woman. This young woman, her name was Mary. She was hitchhiking from Minneapolis to Chicago. She was last seen being picked up on the side of the road by this gentleman, who was last seen kicking dirt and leaves over something on the side of the road. Neighbors thought it was suspicious. They called the police, and when the police got there, the man was gone, and the body of Mary was on the ground. She had been stabbed to death. And even though they had a detailed description of the man, he was never captured, and the case went unsolved. Well, now I decided to go back. If the place was haunted, maybe it was haunted by this woman. I brought Aaron, the psychic, with me. He wanted me to take a photo of this pillar, which I did. I took dozens that night. The only one out of the ordinary was this one. But as we were about to leave, Aaron believed that the spirit of this woman was trying to follow us back to campus. So we took one last photograph, and I'll let you decide whether or not she was following us, because when the film came back, this is what appeared on the film. People have seen faces and shapes, all kinds of things in what appears to be mist or fog of some sort. The good news is that so many people like yourselves have gone out there to see this spirit. So many media outlets have covered it that the county sheriff has reopened the case looking to find this killer. Believe it or not, this is the most commonly asked question I receive. Where can I go to spend the night in a haunted place? Well, if you have that macabre sense of adventure, you're in luck. Because in Wisconsin, we have all kinds of haunted campgrounds, B&Bs, hotels, motels, and the like. One of my favorite places is in Milwaukee, the old Ambassador Hotel. Today, it's a fine establishment, very upscale. You'll love it. Back in the 1970s and 80s, it was a cesspool. They rented rooms out to drug dealers, prostitutes, criminals, even the occasional serial killer. This is Jeffrey Dahmer, the cannibal of Milwaukee. One night while staying at the Ambassador, Dahmer brought this gentleman home from a bar. They were drinking the night away. The next morning, Dahmer awoke and found the man was dead. Dahmer said he had no recollection as to what had happened. So instead of going to the police to explain the accident, he went out and bought the biggest trunk he could find, came back and chopped the man up and put him in the trunk. Ever since that time, people claim that the Ambassador has been haunted. People have heard what sounds like guests fighting to their death in the room next to them. But when they complain, they find out nobody's staying next to them. Others have seen the ghostly image of a man covered in blood walking through the hallway. He often vanishes right into a wall. It's thought to be one of Dahmer's victims, as we don't know how many other people he may have killed in the building. Others have seen Dahmer himself, his spirit, walking through the old historic lobby. Again, if this is your sense of adventure, you will love spending the night at the Ambassador Hotel. But some other of you might like being out on the free road, the back open roads. Every community seems to have one of those roads you do not want to go on that has a paranormal reputation. And in Wisconsin, one of those roads is right outside of New London. It's called Marsh Road because on each side of the road is marshy swampland. The stories of this place go back at least to the 1950s. They probably predate that by many decades. But one that is timely talks about a homecoming king and queen who went out to the road in a suicide pact and took their lives at the end of a rope by hanging themselves. And now the legend is when you go out there during time of homecoming, which is during October, you will see the ghostly image of that royalty out there on the trees hanging from the phantom noose. But there's even something scarier out there than a haunted couple of teenagers. Because dating back to the same early time period, the story has existed about a creature being out there that shouldn't be there. A creature that couldn't be there. But yet, there it is. People see it staring at them. What are they witnessing? Well, maybe I better let you just take a look. This creature, they call it the goat man. Half goat, half human. People have seen it lurking out in that area for decades. One more sinister version of the tale tells that it was the goat man who killed those high schoolers, and that when the police came out and found their partially torn apart and devoured bodies, they blamed it on suicide to avert panic in the area. But the goat man might not be the scariest thing lurking in Wisconsin. That might happen at a place called Mary Dean outside of Menominee, a small island that was inhabited for many years, and now it's a ghost island, literally, named after a young girl by the name of Mary Dean, who is said to have drowned on a steamboat when she came up, and her body was buried in an unmarked grave on the island. And now her spirit haunts the river where she met her tragic end. But there's a dare here as well. And the dare is pretty fun. So what is the dare? Well, let's take a look. I'm here at the boat landing of Mary Dean, where the dare is that if you're foolish enough to go into the water, the vengeful spirit of Mary Dean will try to pull you under, and you'll meet your watery grave and spend eternity in the river with Mary Dean. So I'm going to take this dare right now. No life jacket, no swimming apparel, just me versus Mary Dean. So let's see how this goes. I know you're all wondering if I survive this or not, but I'll go out into the water. It'll get deep and then shallow and then deeper again. What I love about this is you can camp out on the island. You don't need to register. You don't need to pay. You can just camp out there. Those who see the spirit claim that she acts like a siren, trying to entice them in to help her by saying things like, "Help me, please save me, I'm drowning, I can't swim, don't leave me." Legend is, if you're foolish enough to do so, she will pull you under. Every year people drown right in this spot. I've talked to several of their friends and family who told me the person seemed to be drawn there by some unknown force, and it ended up taking their lives. I'm out here in the middle of the river, waiting for Mary Dean to pull me under. So I sit out there for quite some time. Shoreline. Well, thankfully, the spirit of Mary Dean did not pull me under into those dark, churning, cold waters of the river. So another dare completed. If you like dares like that, you can go to my website and see me do dozens of dares and not have to risk your own life. But the story gets even better, and it involves some dogs out on the island. When it was inhabited, it was said that the dogs mauled some children, so the dogs had to be put to death. Now the legend states that if you park your car at the boat landing of Mary Dean, not only will you see the ghost of Mary Dean, but many claim that they come face to face with the hellhounds of Mary Dean. Hellhounds are large black dogs with glowing red eyes. They've been reported throughout history in nearly every culture on the planet. Many cultures believe these things do the devil's bidding, that they guard portals to hell, and that they are an omen of death. That if you see a hellhound, much like seeing or hearing the Irish banshee, it meant you or someone you know is going to die very shortly. But again, you might be thinking that's nothing more than superstition. Weird hellhounds, I don't believe in any of that. Well, you might change your mind if you head out there. After one of my programs, a big burly biker guy came up to me. You know, the type of guy you wouldn't think would get spooked by anything? Told me him and his buddies took their motorcycles out there at night to see the ghost of Mary Dean. They had no idea about the hellhound legend, but as soon as they got there, they were surrounded by hellhounds. When I asked him why he thought they were hellhounds and not just wild black dogs, he said several things stood out. One, they had glowing red eyes. Not just eye shine, but that red was emanating from the creature. Two, the creatures were nearly transparent. He could see right through them. And three, no matter how fast they went on their motorcycles, these creatures kept up with them. It wasn't until he went to kick one and his boot went right through it that the thing finally disappeared. He told me they did not stop driving until they hit the safety of Chippewa Falls, which is about 20 miles away. But again, maybe you don't want to see hellhounds. Maybe you want to see something bigger. Thanks to my good friend Linda Godfrey, Wisconsin is now known as the werewolf capital of the world. It all began when Linda was working as a journalist in southeastern Wisconsin. She started receiving reports of people traveling down a small stretch of road called Bray Road. There, usually at night, but not always, people reported seeing, for a lack of a better term, a werewolf. Again, the size of a bear, but shaped more like a wolf with a long muzzle and this deep, dark, matted down fur. Some said it was eating roadkill or freshly killed prey at the side of the road. But the good news is that outside of charging at a couple vehicles, the creatures seem to be just as afraid of witnesses as they are of it. And rather than attack people, they seem to want to scurry back into the underbrush undetected. So the good news is, if you go looking for the Beast of Bray Road, most likely you won't be killed. Well, 50-50. Give it a chance. I want you to keep in mind tonight that not all monsters tend to look like this. In fact, some monsters in Wisconsin are even scarier than this, because some monsters roaming our state, well, those monsters looked a little bit more like this. If you don't recognize this gentleman, this is Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield. If you don't recall Ed's story in the 1950s, you may recall some of the books and movies they based on his life, including Psycho, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Silence of the Lambs, and many, many others. You know, most people just recall Ed as a murderer, and true, he was. But before he was captured, he was well-liked in Plainfield. Odd, but well-liked. He would often babysit for kids and bring his neighbors over what he called a venison stew for them to eat. One neighbor told me he recalled his mother getting this stew, and it had such a bad smell to it, she threw it away, which is good for her, because even though Ed was a murderer, his real passion was to wait until it got dark. Then he would fire up his vehicle, head down to the nearby cemeteries, where he would dig up the remains of women that reminded him of his own deceased mother. He would then bring those remains back to his farmhouse, where he lived in squalor. He would use them to make lampshades and furniture. He had skulls all over his house. When he really got a bug in his system, he would make an entire outfit of this material, and he would wear it like a demented Halloween costume as he danced under the moonlight in his front yard. But you see, when we finally caught Gein and discovered how truly evil his crimes were, they wanted to open his house as a museum of horrors that you could pay to go see. But before they were able to do so, it mysteriously caught fire and burned to the ground. Townsfolk torched it, allegedly. But even though the farmhouse is no longer there, many believe Gein was so evil he has forever cursed the area with his presence. And even though the house is gone and Gein is no longer among the living, maybe these people are right, because there are many places tied to Gein that are thought to be haunted, including the cemeteries where he dug up his victims. Many people going to pay their respects to their loved ones go to the cemeteries and see what appear to be a man digging a grave by hand. Yet when they get closer, he simply vanishes into thin air or is not there at all. Others make the pilgrimage out to Gein's final resting place. His tombstone's gone. People kept stealing it, so they just never replaced it. Others go to the old hardware store where he killed Mrs. Warden. For years, up until recently, it was a hardware store. Former employees that we interviewed told me that they'd often be working when they saw what appeared to be a woman come inside looking for help. But when they went to give her some assistance finding what she needed, she simply wasn't there or walked into a wall and vanished. They often told me that they'd be putting up new inventory when all of a sudden things would go flying by some unseen hand. Others have heard the sound of a rifle being shot in the store, even though no rifle had been fired. Until recently, it was a hardware store. Then the hardware store moved. Now the building's empty and for sale. If you're looking to own a piece of the grisly history of Wisconsin, you might want to pick this old building up. But by far the most popular place people go is the old Gein estate. As you saw, the home's no longer there, but many believe Gein's spirit resides here. In fact, one of the first times I went there, I had 2 psychics with me. They had no idea where we were going. They thought we were in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin, which is where Plainfield is. But as soon as I pulled over and I said, this is a field I want to check out, they refused to get out of the car. They were picking up on too much negative energy. And maybe they were right. People have seen Gein's spirit walking the place. People have heard the cries of women thought to be Gein's victims. Others ask me if they think it's possible if they could be cursed by visiting the place because they've been in car accidents, they ran out of gas, all kinds of struck deer out there, all kinds of mishap and misfortune. But as I'm running low on time this evening, I want to end with the type of case that I receive more often than any other. And it's people who contact me and they believe their home is haunted. The overwhelming majority of people who have a ghost story for me, it's about their house. Sometimes they think it's a relative haunting it. They smell grandma's perfume on the anniversary of her death or grandpa's cigar on his birthday. Others have no idea who or what may be haunting it. Some are okay with it. It's not a big deal. It doesn't bother them. Others will do whatever they can to get it out of their house. But I want you to keep this story in mind, because later after the program, when all of you go and put your head down on your pillows and you hear the wind rustling outside your window, I want you to ask yourself, maybe, just maybe, is it possible that that wasn't the wind howling outside your window? And with that, I wanted to save the last 10 minutes we have for any questions, comments, or stories that any of you might have. You can put them right in the chat box right now. If you want more information, you can go to my website where you'll get more than you could ever want or need. But I hope your adventure doesn't end here after the program. Grab one of my books. Go on your own adventure of Wisconsin. And when you do, I think you'll discover that we live in one heck of a weird place. And I mean that in a good way. You're going to see things you've never seen. You'll meet some weird people. And along the way, you might just discover that the scariest thing out there is often yourself. So with that, I again want to thank the library for having me here tonight. If you like programs like this, let them know so you get more of these. If you didn't like tonight's program, let them know so you get fewer of these. But I cannot think of a time in history where the library has served a more important role than they do today. With everything going on with the pandemic, politics, and societal issues, the library is the place, the fabric that keeps our community together. They're a real treasure for any community that has one. So again, in honor of the library, If you want to pick up any of my books on my website, just type in the coupon code library and save 15% off any of my books. So I'm going to end my screen share right now. I'll turn it over to the library and see if we have any questions, comments, or stories from any of you who were brave enough to make it through the entire presentation.
So yes, we do have some questions. One is, what is the scariest, most haunted location in southern Wisconsin that you have investigated?
Great question. I always say that when you go to these places and you're not getting scared, you're not trying hard enough. These are downright creepy spots. For me, right outside of Madison is a small town called Evansville. It's a place called Weary Road, thought to be haunted by a man named Old Man Weary, who when he was alive was said to be a terrible person, harming children and just awful. Even though the legends seem not to be accurate, people still have experiences out there on the bridge. The dare is if you park your car there and turn it off, it won't start again. And Old Man Weary will come chasing you. People claim he's thrown bricks through their back window, and his spirit haunts the entire road. Others have seen weird creatures, shadowy figures, disembodied voices have been heard. A real creepy area. I love it.
Have you ever investigated Paradise Road outside Jefferson, here in Jefferson County?
Yeah, Jefferson, Paradise Road, really cool, small stretch of road, and one of those where a lot of people venture out to test the legend. And there are many legends there of things in the woods, people seeing trees that seem to come alive and will move. People report car trouble on the road and just a sense that, you know, they shouldn't be there. Like it's eerie, it's creepy. And I have to admit, if you're walking there at midnight by yourself on Paradise Road, it is creepy. You'll start picking up your pace just because it's human nature. Even if you don't believe the legends, it's really hard not to get a little spooked. And that's one of my favorite places in southern Wisconsin too.
Cool. Have you heard the stories of the haunted, possessed book rumored to be hiding on the UW Whitewater campus?
Yes, and here is what I'm going to tell you. Every year, people contact me about the book. And the book is a book of death that they have at the university, that when you check it out and start reading it, you will die. I don't know who keeps returning it, but it always gets back to the library. Every year, the library contacts me not have such a book in their collection, which is exactly what you would expect from somebody hiding a death book. But the book is said to cause your death from checking it out. Some people ask at the local public library as well, thinking it might be there. Even the school librarians get questions. But Whitewater, which is known as Second Salem, is thought to be haunted by many different things, including witches. Their water tower is known as the Witch's Tower, and there are several cemeteries surrounding it that are thought to be haunted with witches when you go to Whitewater or Second Salem.
Cool. Another kind of local question, and then we've got some questions about some other areas, but have you ever done research on the Fargo Mansion in Lake Mills?
I haven't. And that's the beauty of this research, that I've been doing it 25 years and I never run out of cases. And every time I do a program, I'm learning new stuff, new places that people have stories about. And I figure if I can do this 25 more years, there won't be one place in Wisconsin that doesn't have a supernatural story attached to it. But if that person would email me or contact me, I'd love to hear more about it.
Great. Yeah. And we'll share your website before you go again. And that's also where you can find your books, correct?
That is correct. Or if you want to tell me stories or find out more stories.
Cool. And then some people have been asking about if you've done anything up in the Superior Duluth area or Upper Michigan, or even in the Peshtigo area where so many people died in the Great Fire. So some of that northern part.
Let me start with Superior and Duluth. Both have haunted mansions. Superior has the Fairlawn Mansion, an old orphanage, but it's not orphans that are said to haunt the place. It's a ghost, apparently, of a former lady that worked there as a servant, as a maid, a housekeeper. And I've had people who had birthday parties there who tell me they've seen her. Others take the tour and see her. And of course, in Duluth, they have the historic Congan estate, better known as the Glen Sheen Mansion, where Mrs. Congan was murdered along with her nurse at the establishment, and they believe the place is haunted too. Both places give amazing tours, and even if you don't believe in ghosts, the mansions are well worth touring just because of how gorgeous they are.
Cool. And anything in Peshtigo in that area?
People talk about, in general, victims of the fire that you can still see and hear them. But in terms of specifics of who or why, you know, so many people lost their lives in fires throughout the Midwest that oftentimes it's very hard to pinpoint who or what it might be. But yeah, Peshtigo, I don't recall any stories from the museum, but it would not surprise me. And they could. You know, I've been doing this for so long in so many states that sometimes I forget places I've been to. Sometimes after a program, live in person, someone will say, have you ever been to this place? And I'll say, I don't think so. And they said, well, it's in your book. And then because I took the photo. Every place in the books we actually visited. So yeah, sometimes I forget about these stories and I have to refresh my memory. Also, some places I haven't been to in 20 years. So when I go back, it's all fresh and new. And sometimes the stories have changed over those decades.
A question about the cemetery in Oconomowoc. They didn't say which particular cemetery. Are you aware of one there?
Probably Lakeview Cemetery, and that's in Oconomowoc, and has a statue of a woman who was said to have drowned in nearby Fowler Lake, which adjoins the cemetery. And not only do they believe there's a sea serpent in Fowler Lake, but they believe the statue of the woman will come to life and move throughout the cemetery, and that she'll often cry and blood can be seen out of her eyes, and that her fingers will turn black right in front of you. So if you are going to look for her, don't put your feet in the water because of the sea serpent. Stay on dry land.
This last question, you talked about both Ed Gein and Jeffrey Dahmer, but and so I guess I have my opinion on the answer to this question, but what's the location with the most morbid history that you've ever visited?
Probably the Gein farm, just because, I mean, both were destroyed. Gein's farm was burned down. They tore down the apartment complex that Dahmer lived in, the entire thing. But I think for me, the tragedy of it and going to these places and realizing that sometimes the monsters are humans. And that's the hardest, of just knowing, even if you have zero psychic ability like myself, going there, you can't help but to become overwhelmed with a sense of sorrow and dread, because these are real people. These are real lives that were shattered by these people. They're not, you know, a fun Halloween story of a headless horseman. You know, these have a lot of anger and sorrow associated with them. So I would say probably Gein's farm is one that I really do not like visiting.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be difficult. Well, I think we got all of our questions in. I want to thank you. These are some interesting stories, some interesting history, and some things to think about. And I'd like to thank everybody who came tonight to our program. And we will be sending out a little survey to everyone afterwards. We're just curious to know how you found out about this program so that we can continue to market to people in ways that you get the information. So thanks again, Chad, and thanks everybody for coming.